feedback for improvement, but that really hasn't found its way into most of clinical teaching, clinical education in the health professions even today. So we find ourselves everywhere employing a model of clinical education based on Osler's apprenticeship, clinical clerkship, that on the surface seems very nice, it's very cordial and so forth. But almost without exception, when we do studies to evaluate the outcomes, the learning outcomes of Osler's apprenticeship model, we often find that the results are very uneven. And we have very bright, motivated, hardworking people who leave clinical education settings with skill sets that are far less than what we would expect. And we pass down these bad educational habits from generation to generation. And we discover that not only among even very junior learners in clinical environments, even sometimes among very senior clinicians, when their skill sets are evaluated with rigor, that we often discover that there are very serious deficits. Does this mean they're bad people? Of course not. The healthcare providers that we're privileged to work with are hardworking. They're committed to patient care. They want to do their very best. The problem is that many folks have never been educated with the degree of rigor that's necessary to ensure their safety and effectiveness. So as you and I, Jeff, have talked about in many cases, we simply have got to move clinical education from the 19th century model to a 21st century model. We have to understand that we know a lot more about instructional science. We know a lot more about evaluation and feedback that can do a much better job of improving the clinical fitness of the doctors, nurses, techs that we're privileged to work with and who render patient care. So we have a lot to do. We have a lot of inertia within the system to address because old habits are very, very difficult to change. But in a piecemeal, incremental way, I think our work at Northwestern has become a model for clinical education in the health professions, especially as the published results clearly indicate the superiority of a mastery model to traditional clinical instruction. So, Jeff, does that do it for you?
Yeah, and I think the most profound thing is the growing body of evidence, many of the studies that we've done ourselves that show practicing clinicians, not just residents and students that are graduating, but also practicing attending physicians and practicing nurses are not meeting the level of expectation on some of the skills on their everyday care. And as you alluded to, this is why we really need to change the way we educate our clinicians for future care.
And I think a key point in this, Jeff, it's often unsaid, is that the only way we can actually improve the current state of affairs in terms of helping people acquire refined skill sets is through assessment and evaluation. And we have to make it very plain from the outset that in a mastery environment, that all assessments, all evaluations of individuals and teams are used for improvement, that we use data, performance data as a tool and not as a weapon. It's never our intent to make people look foolish or less than perfect and so forth. We simply have to overcome this profound issue of evaluation apprehension that's so widespread in the health professions, where being revealed as anything less than perfect is just anathema to doctors and nurses. And we simply have to get over that. And we have to understand that training of healthcare providers, just like folks in other high-impact industries like aviation and nuclear power plant operations, rely heavily on the use of assessment for improvement, to help to get better. And the only way we can help an individual or a team improve on their performance is to constantly assess their skill sets, give them feedback, and establish a pathway to improvement. It's analogous, but not identical, to improving your skill, say, in serving a tennis ball, or becoming a better golfer, or a pianist, you name it. The only way people improve and get better is through assessments, usually via a coach or other folks, and opportunities to practice with improvement. And I think that's a key lesson that we've learned in the education of health professionals over the past 15 years.
So many of our listeners are probably wondering, what is this mastery learning that they're talking about, right? We've been talking about it like it's an old friend, which it is for us, but many may not understand it. So, Bill, tell us what is mastery learning?
Well, mastery learning is a set of principles that's outlined, a shameless plug here, in the textbook that we put together. Everything is there for in great detail, but it's an approach to instruction, learning, and assessment that sets a very high bar. It expects excellence for all, and it means that we identify very clear learning objectives, say skill sets about for example, a clinical procedure. And we create curricula whose purpose it is to see to it that all of our learners achieve all of the objectives to a very high standard. And we've been able to distill a package of 7 elements that are involved in the mastery model that we've employed to help people acquire clinical skill sets like LP, doing a lumbar puncture, clinical judgment and reasoning, managing clinical conditions like status epilepticus in children and adults, and even communication skills, breaking bad news to patients and their families. So what are the 7 elements? Well, first is the idea of baseline or diagnostic testing. That is, sometimes I'm a little bit averse to using the term testing. It's more like a learner exercise, where we establish the current state of affairs for an individual or team as a foundation on which to build. Following base diagnostic testing, we have clear learning objectives for each learner, for each unit of instruction, and then they engage in educational activities, especially deliberate practice after the work of the late Anders Ericsson, which more than anything involves active engagement by the learner toward the accomplishment of the educational objectives. We like to say in the simulation environment in particular, the learners are doing the sweating. They're working very hard toward the goal of skill improvement to a very high minimum standard, which leads us to the specification, which is the 4th feature, minimum passing standards for each of the skill sets that we want learners to acquire. We establish minimum standards usually, but not always, involving a committee of experts who engage in exercises to help us establish those standards. Learners then undergo what's called formative assessment. It is continuous ongoing assessment to chart the progress of their learning accomplishments, sometimes done with learning curves. 6, they engage in what's called evidence-based curriculum advancement. That is, people work very hard, they're measured continuously. Once they reach the minimum passing standard, they're deemed to be fit. For any reason they fall short of expectations, it's not a failure. They simply engage in more practice until the objective is achieved to the standard that the faculty feels is important. And the key thing is that in the end, the learning outcomes for all of our learners are uniform. The only difference is that the amount of time that it takes them to acquire the skill set may vary a little bit. And we find that from our experience, Jeff, you and I know that when clinical skill acquisition is the goal, that most of our learners, 80 to 85%, acquire the skills within the bounds of the expected curriculum. A small handful need a little extra time. So there you have it. The package of 7 elements of the mastery learning model. We call it a package because they work together. And to separate anyone out, to say that, for example, you can ignore the baseline testing really defeats the purpose of mastery learning, because all of these pieces coalesce, they come together to provide the package that's so effective.
And I would tell you that the package for me is simulation-based mastery learning when you add the simulator to it. We've debated in the past several times about even an 8th step, which is long-term retention.
Right.
So, right, because if the skills aren't maintained over time and we just set it and forget it, we haven't done anything.
Yeah, and we understand. We acknowledge that when you operate in a human system, there's always variation, and there will always be forgetting of skills, of knowledge, that sort of thing. And we all need refreshers from time to time. I mean, that's just the way things are in a human system. The model, for example, that's used in the airline industry, that the people who fly us around all the time undergo frequent assessment and reevaluation, and 6 months or annually. I'm not sure exactly what it is. A model similar to that is probably down the road.
So, Bill, what makes it work? Why is mastery learning so effective?
Well, I think here's what's cool about mastery learning. What's really great is first, it involves really active engagement by learners, either individuals or teams. In the simulation environment in particular, they're working very hard to achieve the goals of, say, an instructional unit or a curriculum. And oh, by the way, they're having fun. They're working hard. And when we give them feedback from the data that they produce, they can chart their progress and realize that they're moving toward the goal, the minimum standard that we want. So active engagement is so important. It's not at all passive for the learners or the teachers. Teachers are working very, very hard too, coaching, giving feedback, setting curriculum goals, and so forth. So there's active engagement on both sides. The chief role of the faculty is one of planning, preparation, making sure that the learning environment and opportunities for learning are available. And then when the learning events are occurring, providing frequent and focused feedback to learners as they're working usually in a simulation environment. Another feature why mastery learning works is we set very high standards. Our learners are very eager. They want to be great. They want to do real well. And we set very, very high standards. And almost without exception, our learners are eager and goal-oriented, and they get there. Everybody wants to be great. I've never met a physician in training or a nurse in training who acknowledges that they want to be mediocre. Everybody wants to be great. Another point is, as I mentioned earlier, instruction and assessment in mastery learning are inseparable. Teaching and assessment go hand in hand, and we can't do a good job of helping people become better as clinicians unless we assess their performance and show them the ways to improve. Which gets to the point that I mentioned earlier, that assessment data are a tool and not a weapon. The last thing in the world we want to do is humiliate people or make them look foolish or make them feel bad about themselves. We want to create an environment that's psychologically safe at all times and that provides opportunities always to improve and get better. And then finally, as a consequence of mastery learning environments, I've alluded to this earlier, one of the unexpected outcomes now that we relish greatly is that it really boosts learner morale and a sense of self-efficacy. Why? Because as a consequence of these mastery learning experiences, people realize that they're better doctors, they're better nurses, and they feel great about themselves because we can show them from evidence as well as from their own experience that they're better when they walk out of the learning environment than when they walked in, which is a wonderful goal. And we've never had people as a consequence of these experiences say that it was useless or didn't help them. That's the package, and it works great, and people feel great about themselves, and that's important as well. And I could cite many examples from your own work, Jeff. We've done groundbreaking work in helping residents and fellows acquire skills at central line insertion, doing lumbar punctures, improving skills in surgery with our colleague Eric Hungnes, and we've demonstrated that it works in terms of clinical care in areas that I've alluded to, like pediatric and adult status epilepticus. We've done mastery programs there, and even in some of what are called the softer skills, and I think it's a misnomer, of communication with patients and their families, especially things like breaking bad news and engaging in difficult conversation. And the pioneering work of our colleagues, Julia Vermeulen and Gordon Wood, in the area of physician-patient communication, setting up mastery programs for that domain has been breathtaking and just a wonderful illustration that mastery learning works in a variety of different clinical environments.
And one of the biggest successes, I think, of the simulation-based mastery learning program here at Northwestern has been the ability to show translational science outcomes, i.e., actual improvements in patient care and patient outcomes. What do you see as the road ahead? Where are we going with this simulation-based mastery learning?
Well, I think, Jeff, I see continued work in